All right, today we are covering the, oh God, look at that, my first mistake. So sorry, that's supposed to read the amendment versus a notice. So excuse me, but that's what we're going through today. The amendment, which is the WB-40. So these are just contractual forms that we use within a transaction, and just highlighting when it's appropriate to use an amendment and when it's appropriate to use a notice, and just really making sure that it's clear on the difference between the two. So that is what we are doing today. I think I had the inspection on my mind because the notice and amendment become most confusing when it comes to the inspection contingency, which we'll talk about briefly in this training. But that's where my head was at when I wrote inspection versus notice. So this amendment versus notice, that's what we are working on today. The amendment is labeled as the WB-40 in our zip forms. And a notice is labeled as WB-41. So these are the state given numbered names. So, all right, so an amendment, you use an amendment to change the terms of a contract. So it's for use after an offer is already accepted. So that is a common question that we get when agents are negotiating their offers, their initial offers. You know, what forms do we use when we want to change the terms of an offer? So in those initial stages before an offer is accepted, you would use a counter offer form for that. An amendment, again, is only applicable, only applied once an offer is accepted and buyer and seller want to change the terms of the contract after acceptance. So again, you would never use this form before you have an accepted offer. It's that counter offer that goes back and forth when negotiating terms of that initial offer. In an amendment, the buyer and seller both need to sign in order for it to be executed. So buyer and seller both have to agree to any changes in terms on the offer to purchase. When a amendment is used within a contingency situation, which I'm going to go into more deeply in a minute, the amendment is used to negotiate terms. So you can, I'll make that comment a little bit later. One second. So like an offer or a counter offer, the amendment also must be executed before the binding acceptance date and delivered back in order for it to be valid. So the next slide will show a complete amendment, and I'll show you where those lines are, or point those out to you. But again, so, you know, if you're thinking about when you're negotiating an offer, when you are writing an offer for a buyer, you're putting in that binding acceptance date for that seller to accept it and send it back to you in order for it to be binding. Same applies with an amendment. So especially when negotiating and using an amendment, and we'll talk about it with the inspection contingency, if a buyer proposes an amendment to a seller for some repairs that they want to see done, they're going to indicate a binding acceptance date for that seller to accept those terms. So if that binding acceptance date comes and goes, then the buyer has to, then that the terms of that amendment has expired. So if they do end up coming to an agreement on that amendment, all parties would need to initial a date change in order for it to be valid. Because again, like an offer situation, if one side is proposing terms that the other party is dragging their feet on, then that buyer or seller could change their mind on proposing those terms. So again, binding acceptance date comes into play here as well, just like it does for an offer or for a counter offer. I also want to remind everybody to stop me at any time with questions if something is not clear as we go through this training. Amendments can be offered at any time for any reason by either of the parties. So, a lot of times we're talking about amendments and referring to amendments within the confines of these contingencies. But it needs to be clear that an amendment can be used to change a closing date just because buyer and seller decide that they want to change the closing date, and that can be offered at any time. We'll go through other ways that an amendments can be used later on. But again, the key point here is that this is the tool, this is the vehicle in which you are proposing to change terms on an offer to purchase. So this is what you would use to change those terms. And then last point to make is if the parties do not agree to the amendment, the underlying contract remains in place. So if a party proposes an amendment and the other party does not agree to it, then it's as if the amendment was never proposed at all. Like, it's just the terms of the initial contract remain in place. So just because somebody, and I've gotten this question before, and I'm sure Joni has, is, just because a amendment has been proposed, it's not a unilateral communication. Like, the other party has to agree to it in order for it to be valid and binding and on both parties. Excuse me, I had a phone call coming in. And again, if it doesn't come together, then we're just reverting back to the terms of the initial offer to purchase. Any questions so far? Okay. Next slide. So this is what the amendment looks like. At the top of the page, this is where it's labeled WB-40 amendment to offer to purchase. And it spells it right out here. Use a WB-40 amendment if both parties will be agreeing to modify the terms of the offer. Use a WB-41 notice if a party is giving a notice which does not require the other party's agreement. So it's nice. It's spelled out right here for you on when to use an amendment and when to use a notice. So at the top, number one, buyer and seller agree to amend the offer dated. And this is the offer that the initial offer is dated. So when you wrote the offer, and accepted on. So, I might have an offer that we wrote on March 4th, but we didn't get it accepted until today. So it would read dated March 4th and accepted on March 6th for the purchase of real estate at, and then this is where you're going to put the address. The contract writers decided to highlight changes that occur the most often. So that's closing date and purchase price. So they just put those right at the top here of the amendment to the offer. So line 4, closing date is changed from X to X, and then you'll put the new closing date there. And then again, with purchase price, that's probably the most often changed term in an offer to purchase. They again just isolated it and put it on line 5. Purchase price is changed from X to X. If you're not changing a closing date or a purchase price in an amendment, you're just going to leave those lines alone. And then lines 7 to 30 is where you're going to spell out your changed terms. We'll get to the inspection amendment in a minute. But this is where the main body of the amendment and where you're going to indicate what terms are changed. On line 31, you can attach other paperwork to an amendment. So you might attach an estimate when you are dealing with a inspection contingency. You might attach a rejection letter from a lender on an amendment. Actually, I'm going to take that back. You're going to do that with a notice. You might, all sorts of things that you could attach here, but mostly that's used to make reference to other paperwork that you want to make sure is incorporated into the amendment. So you'll use that line. Another big one could be an inspection report that you might attach there. Line 32, all other terms of the offer to purchase and any prior amendments remain the same. So again, only the terms that are highlighted between 7 and 30 are what's going to change within the offer to purchase. Everything else remains the same unless it is addressed here. Line 33, this amendment is binding upon seller and buyer only if a copy of the accepted amendment is delivered to the party offering the amendment on or before, and this is where you're going to put that binding acceptance date in. Delivery of the accepted amendment may be made in any manner specified in the offer to purchase unless otherwise provided in this amendment. So we're going to default to what the agreed upon delivery methods were in that initial offer. So 9.9 times out of 10, it's just going to be that email address. 37, note the party offering this amendment may withdraw the offered amendment prior to acceptance and delivery as provided at lines 33 through 34. So just like a offer or a counter offer, if the person proposing that offer or counter offer decide at the last minute that they no longer want to offer those terms to the other side, they can withdraw that before that amendment is accepted. So I'll give an example. If you're negotiating that inspection, buyer has offered to the seller, I want to see a $10,000 price reduction for the $20,000 worth of work that came up on the inspection report. And then maybe they had a change of heart and said, no, we want to see all of it done. They would quickly withdraw that amendment and put forth new terms that they want to see done. So again, it has to be prior to that seller or the other party accepting the amendment altogether. Any questions? Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have a quick question. Where do you note, Steph, the change if you've already submitted the amendment to offer, and then there's a change of mind? Do you have to write a full other amendment, or how does that work?
Nope. You can just send a quick email saying the amendment is hereby rescinded, or call them right away as well and say we're withdrawing this amendment. Please disregard.
Okay. Oh, it doesn't have to be in writing?
It does not have to be in writing. Best practice is to put it in writing.
Right. Okay. So, thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question. You don't always have to have a deadline, right? There's not always a time of the essence.
No, you don't. No, you don't. You would, as a buyer's agent, you would want to make sure that you are working within the confines of the inspection contingency deadline. So if you, like, for example, let's say your inspection contingency deadline was up tonight and you have an offer proposed or an amendment proposed, and you don't get that back, and just because there's no binding acceptance date, that would still spur you to need to take action elsewhere with a notice of defects. But it's not like it doesn't have to be valid. Binding acceptance date being written in there does not make it valid. It's the execution of the amendment. So if you don't put anything in there and buyer and seller all agree, it's still valid. But if there is something in there and it's not delivered back by the binding acceptance date, then it's not valid if it's delivered after that date. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So if there is a timeline that you need to adhere to, then it's good to use that line to put a date in there, or
Right.
a date and time, right? But if it's not a time sensitive type of situation, then there's no need to fill something in there.
I mean, I would just best practice still fill in those lines. I mean, where you're going to use your discretion is if it's not, again, like, let's say you're working through an inspection contingency and it's early on in the inspection contingency, you could give the seller a couple days to decide,
Okay.
like, you don't have to give a 24-hour period, for example, where you're kind of putting pressure on them, unless you want to put pressure on them, so
Okay.
it's kind of those.
I was kind of thinking of it in the context of not necessarily for an inspection contingency, but just because I used it recently to add in some verbiage under the additional information section of the offer that I had forgotten initially to put in.
Sure.
And it didn't need to be a time sensitive thing. It was just me, giving some buyers credit toward their
Right.
closing costs.
Right.
So I didn't put a time in there, and that's what I was thinking of when I'm saying I don't think it, I was interpreting as it's not a time sensitive thing, so I didn't put a time in there.
Yeah, and that's fine. I just would still just be in the habit of it.
I would agree to default to always putting a date in there that it expires. What it means is you are maintaining control. You have control over when that amendment is good and when it expires.
Yeah.
By leaving it open, you're giving up the control to the other party.
Mhm.
So if I didn't want to risk that, say, like, it's important to me to give credit to my buyers that are, frontline service workers. And if I made a mistake like that, and hopefully won't again, but I wouldn't want to put a deadline on there and then risk that not being given. Do I then just offer a notice instead of an amendment? Because is that technically not really impacting the seller or any of the other parties except for my buyer?
Well, this is a special circumstance, so it's something that you are offering. I think you probably needed to put it on an amendment because we need to see it on the closing statement. Like, I guess I don't want you to overthink.
Right.
Like, you didn't make a mistake, number one, by not putting a binding acceptance date there. It is a change in term if there is a credit that you are offering, and even though it's not coming from the seller, it still is a change in term of the offer.
The final closing, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why it needs to be executed properly. We kind of get this question when, like, people, and I don't even really have a good explanation for it, just because I don't have see what the consequences, but for example, when sometimes buyers need to change their name slightly, like, I've seen it where it's Tammy Mayhew Jr. and the junior wasn't added in the initial offer, and we need to change and add the junior, for like, you would think we could just send a notice to the other side letting them know that, because it doesn't really impact the other side that much, but those changes have to be put on an amendment.
Okay. So everybody's in agreement.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
I was just clarifying it so that everybody's in agreement with the change. Could somebody on the other side potentially say, we don't want that to be changed?
It could. This is where, yeah.
Okay.
We could kind of go down all these little rabbit holes of, what happens if they don't, right? I mean, those kind of situations we just need to take as they come, but like,
Okay.
you know, if the other side is doing their job, I mean, it's like, this is inconsequential, this doesn't change your bottom line, you know.
It's a little
And
bit of a gray area, I'm sensing.
yeah.
Okay.
I
But
mean,
back
a
to Joan,
name change definitely sounds like it would fall under the category of notice because, you know, but I might be getting nitpicky.
yeah, I mean, I wish I could give you, I mean, I think where it's like a line has to be drawn because, like, let's say they're just changing a buyer out, I mean, I think it's like protection for like who is actually buying the property, right? So like, if it's a major change in somebody's name, you know, or, you know, it could be misconstrued that's a different buyer altogether, you know, so. Yeah,
I think
it's,
when in doubt, do an amendment so that both parties are on the same page and they agree. And that's sort of what Steph is saying, because eventually we'll have to be correct on the closing statement and title has to know exactly what it is. So if a name change or a buyer change name is just done on a notice, that's sort of a unilateral decision, but maybe the sellers didn't agree. And, you know, then you've got a loose end and you've got a not very particular offered in place. So
and
best to always defer, I think, back to an amendment.
and also too, a lot of this is like title company CYA, you know, they want everything to be on the up and up and making sure that it was like presented to all sides, you know, like they can't execute some changes without knowing that it was done on an amendment and all parties agreed to it.
And remember, anything that goes on an amendment, an attached inspection report, any reference to corrections that need to be done to the property, anything put on an amendment or notice has to be sent to the lender. And the lender is going to see those requested changes to the offer. And, you know, a lot of them may make a big difference to the lender. It may mean that that buyer is not really qualified, considering those changes that are being made to the offers. So you always have to keep the lender in mind when you're drafting an amendment.
Yeah, I can definitely get into that more too when we go through an inspection amendment specifically. Because yes, that's all. Yeah, we need to make those points. So well, moving on just to like the structure of the amendment. Line 39 is where we would indicate who drafted it. Line 41 is where you indicate who presented it. So if I was a buyer's agent drafting an inspection amendment, I would put my name there on line 39, then I would deliver it to the listing agent and they're going to present it to their seller and they would put their name on line 41. Buyers sign on the left-hand side, so on 43 and 46. Sellers sign on the right-hand side. And then if the amendment is rejected, you would have the party's initial that they're rejecting an amendment as well. So that is how it is structured. And now we'll get into these things in the amendment in action. So where we get the most questions and regarding amendments is more often around use insofar as do I use a notice or an amendment within the terms of the inspection contingency, and it depends on the scenario. And that's the number one question that the WRA gets as well. And then also just how to structure requests. So as a buyer's agent, the best way to structure the wording on an inspection amendment. So we'll go through that as well. So first off, when using an amendment in the inspection contingencies, you're going to use an amendment when the buyer wishes to negotiate the results of an inspection. So this is when they're going to come to the seller with their requests after an inspection has been done. Buyer makes requests of the seller based on the findings of the inspection or the follow-up inspections. So when I was getting ready for this training, I was referring back to a training that Joan did last year, where it was commented that like you have your inspection and then you have your follow-up inspections, and you're kind of in this like information gathering phase. And then once you have all of the information that you need in order to properly go to the seller with your requests, then you'll lay it all out on an amendment. So in just like practically speaking, when you're working through this, you're going to receive an inspection report. There's going to be time for the buyer to review, come up with their own thoughts on what is concerning to them and what's not. They are also going to maybe want to have additional inspections of particular components of the house, depending on what it is. So, my point here is you're not going to get an inspection report and necessarily like start drafting your amendment. Like there's like a discernment period, just a period here where you need to get your ducks in a row, get all of the information that you need in order to make informed decisions on how you want to respond to somebody. So it could be, inspection falls on today and you might not be prepared to write an amendment to a seller for another 4 or 5 days. So I just want to make that comment regarding how it's used in the inspection contingency, or just oftentimes how inspection contingencies this period goes. When a seller receives an amendment, the seller has the option to accept that amendment that's proposed to them, or reject the amendment altogether, or propose their own amendment. Key thing here is going back to a previous slide. If the amendment is not agreed upon, then we're back to the same terms that we were in the initial offer. So nothing has been executed, no agreement has been made. If an amendment is proposed and rejected by the other side or ignored by the other side, then we don't have an execution of changed terms. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. I know I'm repeating myself a lot, but just to kind of nail that in. And then the buyer may also propose another amendment. So, oftentimes, if a buyer proposes an amendment, seller now is in their period of time where they're kind of contemplating whether or not they want to accept it or not. They could be sitting on it, and buyer might want to withdraw that amendment and propose another amendment. If the seller rejects the amendment, then buyer still has an opportunity to propose another amendment. I think the point is that nothing is officially executed until it's put on an amendment and both sides are signing it. So another thing I want to comment on is a lot of times agents will kind of hash all of these things out prior to an amendment being drafted. And that is one way of doing it. So if if Joni and I are negotiating an inspection, we're going back to our clients, like, does this work for you? If the seller agrees to this, does this work for the buyer? And we're coming to terms verbally before laying it all out on an amendment. That can happen as well. So And this is where like nuance of negotiating comes into play here, because, and probably a whole separate training, but just like this idea that, you know, sometimes it might be appropriate to get something down on paper if you've got a stubborn person on the other side who just needs to have it in front of them, you know? So like, you just have to like kind of understand when you are getting things down on paper right away, or if it's a situation that you could just negotiate verbally, and then put it all on paper. So that's kind of going off on what the point of this inspection or what this training is for. Just additional comments that can be made when it situationally when you're negotiating an inspection. So I'm going to get to how it should be drafted. So all right. So you can see there's a lot on here. If you are a buyer's agent and, you know, you guys have had the inspection, you've had follow-up inspections on the roof, you've had follow-up inspections on, let's see here, I'm just going to cite the roof for now, because that's all just clearly laid out that there was an estimate dated here. So you've gotten your inspection report, you've had a follow-up inspection on the roof, and now you've got an estimate with the exact scope of work that needs to be done in order to fix that roof. Then I see here that the buyer also has issues with the GFCI outlet to the bathroom. We need a plumber to look at the home and make proper repairs. These are things that based on 1, 2, and 3, I can see that we've had a roofer come out and look at the roof and give an estimate ahead of time. And then we've got bullet points 2 and 3, where the buyer is just going to request that these contractors come in and make repairs. So best way to structure this as a buyer's agent would be starting at the top on line 6, seller at seller's expense shall have the following repaired prior to closing. Paid invoices and lien waivers to be provided no later than 3 days prior to closing. So we're spelling it out for the seller on how we want this to be done. We want these repairs to be done no later than 3 days prior to closing, and we want you to provide the paid invoices from the contractors and the lien waivers so that we have evidence that the repairs were completed. And then we're going to start listing what exactly we want to see done. So on line 9, bullet point 1, roof repairs per the scope of work on estimate dated 10/19, performed by AD Roofing. So not only are we telling them what we want done, we are dictating who we want it to be done by. And then that estimate is going to be attached on line 28. Bullet point 2, licensed electrician to add GFCI outlet to upper bathroom, secure exterior light, and ensure power to the back exterior outlet. So buyer is communicating to the seller, I don't care who does it, I just want a licensed electrician to be the one who is making these repairs. Bullet point 3, licensed plumber to assess and correct the following plumbing concerns: lack of hot water at both main and upper bath, repair loose tub spout, repair loose toilet, and on and on. So these I can tell were lifted directly from an inspection report. Again, the buyer does not care who does the work. They just want to see that it's a licensed plumber who is doing the report. And then in order to make it crystal clear for a seller, they're listing the exact components that they want to see addressed. That's another point to make about this, is just, this is the way using an amendment is a way for everyone to just make sure that we're all on the same page. So another probably most often cited concern from, I'm just guessing here, but like vague inspection amendments requests are also another point of potential contention later on. You don't want to be vague when it comes to the inspection contingency and how repairs are done. We want everything to be crystal clear. And I think it's a good way to like use this as a roadmap for a seller on how to repair things when it comes to an inspection. Again, just so that we can point right back to it, you know, later on, when we get that paid invoice and lien waiver, and if we don't see that the loose tub spout was addressed, we can compare and contrast the two items. Number 4, provide scope of repair, paid invoice, and lien waiver for a furnace repair made on 10/18. So this is another way that you can ensure, you know, seller has done prior work. So it looks to be the case here where a furnace was repaired prior to when this inspection amendment was drafted. And they're also now going to use this as a vehicle to say, I know this was done. I want you to provide the paperwork to me. And again, just a directive to the seller on something that they want to see done, or want to see in their hands regarding a repair. And then there are a number of ways how inspections can be negotiated. And again, I think that's for another training as far as like all of the different ways that things can be done. But, you know, typically in an inspection contingency negotiations, you're asking a seller to make repairs, or you're asking for concessions on the repairs. So bullet point 5 is closing cost credit of $1,500 shall be provided to buyer at closing. So let's say there were extra repairs on this inspection report that buyers agreeing to, or pretty much notifying to the seller, I'm okay with taking those on. I just want a $1,500 credit so that I can take that money and do those repairs after closing. So another way that inspection contingencies, of course, can be negotiated is with a simple price reduction. So that's a myriad of ways. Point is here, if we're asking for repairs, we just want to be crystal clear to the seller on how they should be done, when they need to be done by, what kind of paperwork needs to be provided, and who's paying for it, right? So come to Joni and I with questions always on inspection amendment writing, and then just situationally, like discussing the different ways that it could be done as well. And then now to Joni's point that she was making earlier, anything attached to an inspection amendment does get to the lender. So that is also another point that we want to make, that we don't necessarily want to be attaching inspection reports to our inspection amendments. We're of course delivering inspection reports to the other side, to the sellers, so that they can see what came up. But where it gets dangerous is if the buyer's lender has somehow incorporated the inspection report into the file, then just by their processes and what they are required to do and obligated to do, that might get to an underwriting team who will come up with their own set of things that need to be done. So we are cautious of always attaching inspection reports on amendments, FYI. Come to us with questions for that too, if you ever have. Or making any reference to the inspection report as well. So sometimes people will cite page numbers, and we want to just warn people against doing things like that as well. If we are referencing page numbers on an inspection amendment, then that's going to prompt a lender to come to that buyer's agent and say, hey, we need to see that inspection report because we see it cited here. So all stuff that you wouldn't know to do or not to do. It's just when you start practicing, this is where these kind of things are learned and come up. So believe me, I've attached inspection reports to amendments and then lenders coming to me and saying, you don't want to do this. Let's figure out another way. So that's how I learned. We've got a chat. Is it possible to do training on one-party listings? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I'm going to recap really quick the use of an amendment with the inspection contingency. A little bit later, we're going to get into the other alternative method of communication when it comes to the inspection contingency. But we're using the amendment within the inspection contingency to negotiate with the seller on items that they want to see done in order for them to feel comfortable moving forward in the deal. So we are going to use that with an amendment always. And first and foremost, practically speaking, that is always the best course of action. Attempt to negotiate with the seller when it comes to repairs on a home and repairs as a result of an inspection. Okay, any questions?
Do we have to use an amendment to remove the inspection contingency, or can that be done as a notice?
That can be done as a notice where a buyer's waiving
Right.
an inspection contingency. That can be done via notice. Yep.
Thank you.
So amendment in action, the appraisal contingency. So when an appraisal comes in lower than the purchase price, the buyer may want to propose an amendment to the seller to lower the purchase price to the appraised value. So that might come up where, especially in this competitive marketplace where offers are going for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 over list price, you might have an appraisal come in that is lower than the initial agreed upon purchase price. If that happens, the buyer can, and we'll get into all of their options, but the buyer can propose an amendment to the seller to lower the purchase price to the appraised value. Other terms.
I'm sorry, Steph. I'm sorry for the interruption. I have a question regarding the appraised value.
Yes.
So let's say that that comes lower than the listing price or
Yes.
the purchase price. So in the case if the seller refuses to adjust the price, are we free to walk away?
That's where the notice will come in. And depending on how you have written the initial contract, the initial offer to purchase, if you gave the seller the right to cure in the appraisal contingency, if they don't agree to coming down to that purchase price via an amendment, then the buyer is going to serve a notice to the seller. And now they're going to force the seller's hands and say, before I was asking you to come down via this amendment, coming down to the purchase price, now I am forcing your hand and saying to you, I need you to come down to the appraised value or let me out of the deal. So that's how it works in the right to cure with the appraisal contingency. So at that moment, the seller could say to themselves, oh crap, I actually don't want to let them out of this deal. I will have to come down to the appraised value and keep them in the deal. Or they can say, I've got another offer in the wings. This person's cash. They don't care about an appraisal. I'm going to let you out of this deal and move forward.
Right.
So that's how it would work. Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask if they wanted to stay in the deal, the seller would then draft an amendment coming down on the price. Is that right?
If the seller wanted to remain in the deal,
Right, after the notice has been given by the buyer that they must come down on the price.
So in that scenario, a seller could propose their own amendment, but the buyer does not have to agree to it. I mean, they could say, no, it's all or nothing.
It is the buyer's desire that the seller comes down, so that's why the notice is being sent, correct?
Say that one more time.
It's the buyer's desire that the seller comes down on the price for this amendment, right? Or they asked for an amendment first, and then they asked, and the seller either ignored or rejected it. So then the buyer sends a notice that they must come down on the price or let me out of the deal. And the
Right.
seller reconsiders and says, okay, I don't want to let them out of the deal. How do they communicate that?
They would just send a notice back saying, I am electing to come down to the purchase price.
Okay, not an
So-
amendment. They would use the notice. Okay,
Yep.
okay, thank you.
Yeah, so that, and there are reasons why we are using amendments first versus notices, and we'll get to that when we talk more about the notice, but the notice prompts and spurs this action and these considerations, and giving seller the power to make decisions that a buyer may not necessarily want to give them that option on the first go around. So that's why we are using amendments first, attempting to make negotiations before we are getting to what we call this final line in the sand to spur this type of action and to spur the ability for the seller to release a buyer. So that's where it can get dangerous, because a buyer may offer, maybe, let's say we've got a buyer who gets a lower appraisal, but they're actually willing to go forward, and they're just going to see first, let's see if the seller comes down to this appraised value. I know in my head that if they don't come down, I'm still going to move forward, but let's just see if we can get away with it, or let's see if they'll come down. And we wanted to do that with an amendment first, because we don't want to give the seller the option to let us out of the deal if there is another offer waiting in the wings for them. We don't want to give them that power if that's not our intention, right? So for one buyer, it may be the case that they could move forward with the purchase price even though the appraised value is lower, but it might be the case for another buyer where, shoot, I am not going to be able to get this loan unless the seller comes down to the appraised value. And then in that case, it might be appropriate for the buyer to just serve a notice right away, because it's really all or nothing. They have to see that appraised value come down. So they might just serve that notice right away to prompt those decisions by the seller. So it's all just situations, buyer situations on when you want to use a notice first or an amendment. And this is all, let me clarify too, this is all working within contingencies that give her the right to cure, which is the inspection contingency and the appraisal contingency. So, in other terms that we need to give notice on, or in other appropriate ways to use amendments and notices don't apply to other contingencies. It's only contingencies that have the right to cure. So, and I'm going to backtrack. I said it was only the inspection contingency and the appraisal contingency. That's not true. There's well water testing contingencies that offer the right to cure, septic, private on-site waste treatment contingencies. But point being is any contingency that involves the right to cure is where you want to make more consideration about whether you're using an amendment or a notice. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. So other terms that you could just, it's anything under the sun, but most common is like changing the closing date, extending contingency deadlines. So this is a good You know, again, kind of using the inspection contingency. So maybe we're in this information gathering phase for the buyer, and contractors can't get into a home before the inspection contingency deadline. So, you know, buyer's gonna come to the seller first and say, I'm not ready to tell you I'm not ready to make our official requests as it relates to repairs that we want to see done. But I am going to come to you and request an extension on the contingency deadline so that we can have more time to figure this out. You know, and that's all a negotiating point. You know, seller might stay strong and say, no, sorry, this is what you have agreed to in that initial offer, right? So, but this is the vehicle that you would use in order to extend that contingency deadline, financing contingency deadline, appraisal contingency deadline, you know, all need to be agreed upon in order for them to change. So it's all conversations with the listing agents and between the listing agents and the buyer's agents. But this is a good example of something that you, like, let's say the lender on a financing contingency can't get loan commitment in time. You know, it's that decision or that communication is not a unilateral notice to the listing agent, hey, lender can't get loan commitment in time, we're extending the loan commitment deadline. That's not how that works. The seller has to agree to that, because once that contingency deadline comes and goes, then the seller is given options, you know, that they might want to reserve the right to exercise later on. So I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, so I apologize. But again, it's just anything that's changing in the offer needs to be executed by both parties in order for it to be valid. You would use an amendment to incorporate addendums. So let's say midway through, you guys decide that there's going to be an occupancy agreement and you need to fill out an addendum O. You would fill out the addendum O, and then you would use the amendment to incorporate that addendum O into the offer to purchase. So, you know, it's just a simple addendum O is hereby incorporated into the offer to purchase. You're putting that addendum O on the attachment line, and then you're also having all parties sign that addendum, the occupancy addendum, to show that they've received it. Final walkthrough scenarios I put on here. So, you know, sometimes there are last minute negotiations happening based off of the results of a final walkthrough, you know. So if, let's say, buyer sees a trickle of water in the basement and they need to see they want a contractor out to look at it, you would address that in an amendment. If there is, you know, if there is a lot of stuff left behind and we need to call in a hauler to come in, you know, seller agrees to have a hauler come in and empty out the contents of the home, or, you know, I mean, it could be something as simple as that the amendment is used for. So adding home warranties along the way, you know, maybe at some point seller agrees to offer a home warranty to the buyer, you would use that to add it. So it's really whatever change the buyer and seller want to see done. So this is the vehicle. Then I said it once again, but anything buyer and seller agree to must be executed via an amendment, get in writing. And when I say get in writing too, what key point Joni and I would want to make here is that there are no verbal agreements in real estate. Anything that you guys come to an agreement upon should get down in an amendment so that we have proper record of it, proper execution of it. You know, so often we've get these, seller agreed that they would take care of that prior to closing. And, you know, maybe it's something as simple as, I don't know. Like, let's say something happened with my refrigerator midway through a transaction, you know, and I need to get it fixed. And I say to the buyer's side, oh, my refrigerator failed. I got to get a new one. You know, get that in writing. We need to make sure that anything that changes or anything that any promises made are getting down on an amendment so that we have something that we can refer back to. Because let's say I promised to replace a refrigerator, final walkthrough comes and the refrigerator is the same. And buyers are saying, well, you told me you were going to replace it. And I say, I changed my mind. Like you know, is that acting in good faith? No, but it's again, just CYA always. Any questions? What time do we have? Oh my gosh. Okay. Do you guys want to hang in there with us while we go through the notice? Okay. I don't know how we got to this.
And Steph, we have a meeting at 1 too.
We do have a meeting at 1. Okay. So the notice. This is unilateral communication. So this is used for communicating information to the other side that does not need to be agreed upon. It does not change terms of a contract. Buyer and seller do not both need to sign a notice. It's for use in contingencies with the right to cure provisions that trigger action for the seller, as I had stated before. And I just wanted to make this point that an offer to purchase, like within the provisions of an offer to purchase, it identifies when a notice needs to be used and when it doesn't. So you always have that to rely on when you have a question about whether or not you would need to use a notice. So the notice, this is what the notice looks like. And on line 1, again, notice by seller or buyer, and depending on who is delivering this notice, you'll strike which party is to leave open so that it's identified who is delivering the notice, excuse me. Again, outlined pretty much the same way, relates to the offer to purchase dated blank and accepted on blank. And then on line 3 is where you'll put the address. And notice is given that, and then you'll use the lines between 5 and 26 to state what the notice is. On line 28, you'll state who drafted the notice. And on line 30, line 28 is when you'll state who drafted it. Line 30 gives a caution: once delivered, a notice cannot be withdrawn by the initiating party without the written consent of the receiving party. So that's also very important. And we can talk more about that when it comes to the inspection contingency, or any contingency with the right to cure provision. Line 32 is signature of party initiating notice. And line 35, once we receive that notice on the other side, notice was delivered by, as the person who's drafted the notice, you're also going to state on line 35 when you delivered the notice. On line 38, it gets into actual receipt. In certain small number of cases, we need to document when the other party has received the notice. And on lines 39 through 41 is where you would document when the other party actually received the notice. There's only like 2 scenarios where we need actual notice. Let me stop for a second. Joan, do you want to go to the meeting and then I'll hop on when we're done, or what do you think is the best way?
Well, there's so much good meaty stuff in this part. Maybe I can finish this up next Monday using the second half of this.
Yeah.
Because There's certainly an awful lot of information regarding the notice and the right to cure. So we can
Guys,
substitute that as the topic for next Monday, and I'd be happy to finish that up for you.
What do you guys think? So I also know it's an hour-long training. You've got things to do.
I'm good if we can continue next week, because I'd like to.
Oh, yeah, we'll
the
continue
notice.
for sure. We're not gonna stop short. We will just continue this and push it the rest of
Oh,
this
okay. Cool.
to next week.
Yep,
You guys good with that?
sounds good to me.
All right,
That's okay.
And I'll go join the meeting.
okay. All right, you guys, then we'll just continue on with the notice and we'll next week and kind of relate it back to an amendment, and Joni will go over when it's appropriate to use the notice, when it's not, proper ways to draft the notices when it comes to certain contingencies. So thank you. I mean, that's good that it took so long. We got into a lot of stuff, so that's good.
It was good, thank you.
I'm
Thank you.
afraid to leave the
a
meeting
good one.
because I'm afraid I would end the meeting.
Got it. No, I'll end now. Okay, thank you guys so much for your time, and thank you for
Thank
the
you.
questions. We love questions. So, all right, we'll see you
Absolutely.
next week at 1, okay, at 12.
All right, bye, thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.